Dehya is probably the character that was released with the most disappointment out of any 5-star we have ever had. A disappointment that I've seen scar the Genshin community, with any new character being touted as looking even mildly disappointed, talked about as the new Dehya. But Dehya is in a completely different spot than she used to be, as there have been a ton of new artifact sets, weapons, and most importantly, new teammates that have completely shifted how we approach using Dehya, to the point where she's not only usable, but fairly competitive with some of the best options in the game. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Dehya has two main roles, that of an off-field pyro applicator, as well as an on-field carry. Her off-field playstyle using her skill is the one that gets the most attention, and for a good reason. It has a 12-second duration that applies off-field pyro as a coordinated attack that can be triggered once every 2.5 seconds. In addition, she reduces the damage taken by your on-field character by half. She takes some of that damage onto herself and then heals herself back up. She also provides infinite interruption resistance, but unfortunately that interruption doesn't last the full 12 seconds. It only lasts 9, as it's activated by one of her passives. Her burst is her on-field playstyle, and basically you're just going to tap the normal attack button after using her burst, and she'll punch the enemies. This doesn't count as normal attacks, however, so it won't trigger characters that require normal attacks such as Xingqiu or Yuan, which definitely greatly reduces her synergies. This burst is actually pretty good damage, but it doesn't last for very long. It says it only has a 4-second duration, but as you're tapping normal attack, it extends the duration, but it still ends up being quite short, and that's the main source for her on-field playstyle dealing less damage, and generally not being recommended by too many people, although we are going to talk about how to make it work. Her constellations are very good for her, with C1 giving her increased HP scaling, C2 extending the duration of her field, but it does not extend the interruption resistance, so make sure you don't get baited by that. C3 is a burst talent level increase, which will help her damage. C4, very important for energy recharge, as her energy recharge needs are crazy high without it. C5 really doesn't matter, it's just the skill talent level. And then C6 giving her a ton of extra crit rate and crit damage, greatly increasing her overall damage. By the time she hits C6, she's actually a very good on-field character. Even at C1 and C4 and a little bit for C3, she also becomes better and better. Given the fact that you are guaranteed at least one copy of Dehya for free every year, and that her signature weapon is available from the Chronicled Wish, or at least it was before, so we can expect that it will be again at some point, I do think building towards C6, especially as you lose other 50/50s hopefully to Dehya, I do think that is a reasonable thing to aim for, especially since it's not just C6. C1 and C3 and C4 also give her a significant damage boost. So I think if you really love Dehya and you want to main her, she's your favorite character, I definitely do recommend building her into her on-field playstyle. But if you're just looking for a high-value character that you don't have to wish for, and you're looking for a support that fits into one of the roles that we're going to talk about, she's definitely worth building as an off-field support as well. Let's talk about how you do that. If you're building her as a DPS, level 90 could be a good idea because she does scale both off of attack and HP, and you're trying to get the most damage out of her possible, but it's definitely not a priority as she is just a normal scaling character, not a full HP scaler or EM scaler like some characters, so leaving it 80 for now is totally fine. Also, 89 is a very efficient place to stop rather than taking that extra level to 90, which is quite a resource sink. She of course does also have a plunge playstyle with Shenhe, which we'll talk about as well. If you're using the plunge playstyle, leveling up her normal attacks is critical. I'm not sure where plunge and her burst damage quite even out. At Constellation 0, I would say that her plunge playstyle is a good bit stronger. I'm guessing by the time you hit C4 that her burst playstyle might outpace, well, it should outpace the plunge one, maybe even C3 if you have a good build. So if you're building her for damage, it's either going to be burst or normal attack, depending on if you're doing a normal damage build or a plunge build. Otherwise, if you're using her as a support, you can put a few levels into her skill. I think level 8 is a good place to stop just because it's not too important. You get up to 50% damage mitigation, but 46% is quite good as well to save all the resources from going to 9 and 10. Normally, if you're dying, the reason isn't because you're at 46 instead of 50% damage mitigation. and the damage just isn't significant enough to level up or even build for. For weapons, for a DPS build, whether it's a Shen Yun plunge or her burst, her signature is going to be the best. It's also just a good generalist claymore, so if you happen to get it, it's overall not a bad pickup. Redhorn Stone Thresher is her second best, which I don't have. Reminder that Serpent Spine does not work with her. As she takes that damage, it removes the passive, so you can't use Serpent Spine with her and get the effect. If you don't have Beacon or Redhorn, the Verdict is an alright stat stick, giving you the base attack, crit rate, and a bit of attack. Rain Slasher, pretty good for a 4-star, about the same as the Mailed Flower. And if you don't have any of those, you can use the Natlan Craftable. If you're using Support Dehya, which is the most recommended playstyle for most players, Sacrificial Greatsword is generally her best in slot weapon. At Refinement 5, you have an 80% chance to end the cooldown. Now, you're not going to use that right away, you're going to save it, because the normal cooldown is 20 seconds. So being able to use the skill after only 16 seconds is actually very relevant, and it really helps her be a better choice for characters with short rotations like Mualani, Clorinde, etc. It's often one of her main selling points that makes her better. If you're using Support Dehya and you're not using Sacrificial Greatsword, you're definitely losing a lot of that value, because waiting the full 20 seconds can often extend rotations and really hurt your overall clear times. For artifacts, this one is a little bit complicated. Basically, the artifact landscape of Genshin Impact has completely changed. Before, it seemed like there were very defined sets that were almost always better, but the more we get super high value carries such as Mualani, Arlecchino, Neuvillette, these really high value characters, even other characters like Kinich and Clorinde, they have very high multipliers, and you basically just want to match up whatever buffs that are compatible with the characters that you're playing as. So rather than giving you all the artifacts right now and what teams they're for, I'm going to give you her build. I'm going to include artifact recommendation as part of the team section. So let's talk about that next. I think Dehya is pretty much at her best when using Kinich. I found my Dehya runs basically exactly the same as my Xiangling runs in terms of time, but Dehya doesn't require energy to function. Not only that, Xiangling is not doing all that much damage on this team because she ideally wants to be running the Deepwood Memories artifact set. So I like to run Dehya on Deepwood Memories here. I like to use her before Bennett to maximize Bennett uptime for my Kinich. And my favorite Kinich version here uses Emily, but you can absolutely use Farina instead. Both of these teams are absolutely fantastic, very fast, very fast clears, very strong, very comfortable, easy to play. Once again, Dehya on Sacrificial Greatsword to get the quickest, tightest rotations possible. And I would say that this is a team where Dehya is legitimately best in slot. I do expect the Pyro Archon to outpace her, but if you have yourself a Dehya, it's not like it takes a huge amount of resources. She can run any stats on Deepwood Memories that you want, just put her on HP, I suppose, for more tankiness, but it really doesn't matter. As long as she's on Deepwood Memories here, she is contributing hugely to this team by providing off-field Pyro that Kinich needs for burning, as well as the Deepwood Resistance Shred. So Dehya mains rejoice, this is a team where she is best in slot, generally speaking. Technically, Xiangling's better, but I definitely would prefer Dehya. Another team that I definitely overlooked where she's arguably best in slot is Overload Clorinde. I know a lot of people don't find Overload Clorinde that good, and that's mostly because I think most people just don't have Chevreuse C6. So this team definitely does work best if you have Chevreuse C6. And one can argue if you have Chevreuse C6, you probably have Raiden C2. And if you have Raiden C2, then you're probably back to using Xiangling again and not using Dehya. So this team might be a little bit fake. It might be a little bit unrelatable unless you're sort of like a dolphin who loves Clorinde and you just wanted to get C6 Chevreuse for your Clorinde specifically. Nevertheless, whether you have C6 Chevreuse or C0 or anything in between, Dehya is fantastic on this team. Originally, you'd expect that Thoma would be better here, but Thoma has one little problem, in that the cooldown for his burst is 20 seconds, whereas Clorinde's cooldown for her skill, which is her longer cooldown ability, is only 16 seconds. What that means is that Thoma ends up extending your Clorinde's rotation, and Clorinde Overload can have super fast and snappy rotations. You ideally really want to hit that 16 seconds. You don't want to be waiting extra time for someone to come off cooldown, and that's where Dehya comes in. Even though Thoma provides a small normal attack bonus, because you have a Sacrificial Greatsword, you can get those tight 16-second rotations very consistently, which in practice, if you play well, can lead to faster clear times, and the interruption that she gives is very, very nice for Clorinde, as a lot of people find they can't properly play her without interruption resistance, and if you use her last in the rotation, then almost all of Clorinde's skill uptime does have the resistance to interruption. So overall, Dehya is actually now my go-to choice for Clorinde teams. You'll want to go with Tenacity of the Millelith for this team. Giving all party members 20% attack is very, very good. It not only affects Clorinde, but it helps out Fischl as well. So yeah, she may not have the 15% normal attack damage, but the 4-second faster rotation makes up for it. One of the OG uses for Dehya, and one of the first teams that kind of put her on the map as being worth using, was Neuvillette teams. You get the occasional vape. You can use her with Nahida for some burn vape action, some Emily. I don't know how consistent it really is. I don't think it's that consistent, but I think basically the long and the short of it is she's at least a character that activates Neuvillette's passive. And if you don't have C1 Neuvillette, you're liable to being interrupted. And Shalonen's resistance shred lasts a really long time, so using Neuvillette, then Farina, then Shalonen to get the buff, and then using Dehya for interruption resistance and activating Neuvillette's passive, and maybe you get the occasional vape here and there. Overall, yeah, this may not be the greatest top of the meta Neuvillette team, but if you don't have Zhongli, you don't want to pull Zhongli, like Dehya's a free unit now. She's a unit that you can just grab and get a copy at C0. You know, if that means you don't have to pull a Zhongli for this team, that's some good value right there. Plus, Zhongli, at least on this team, doesn't activate Neuvillette's other passive, so arguably this is better. Plus, she has a secret little trick where when you use her with Shalonen, you can give Dehya the Archaic Petra artifact set on this team. You don't actually have to create the crystallize to use Archaic Petra, you just have to pick up the crystallize. This can be super annoying to do because Shalonen will often accidentally pick up the crystallize herself. So you have to be very mindful and very aware and figure it out, and maybe do a reset to do your first rotation, which can be quite annoying. But if you can pick it up and you can manage to figure it out, again, it is a pain, but a 35% damage bonus is absolutely nothing to sneeze at. So on the whole, I really, really like this team. And then Shalonen is of course holding the scroll set. If you're using a different character and not Shalonen, like if you're using Kazuha here instead, then you can give Dehya the scroll set, and you're not getting as much of a damage bonus as you are with the Shalonen team, but you're still at least getting something. On the whole, although she's definitely not a top meta choice for Neuvillette, she's a great budget choice that can potentially save you a 5-star pull. Granted, her use does dwindle greatly for Neuvillette when you get Neuvillette C1. So if you do plan on getting Neuvillette C1, it's kind of like whatever, but again, she's a free unit, so you can always use her in the meantime on a team like this. Speaking of interruption resistance, something like Linny or something like Arlecchino, I'm still a pretty big fan of Dehya on either of these teams. Similar to the Clorinde one, you're going to be using the Tenacity of the Millelith artifact set. And once again, is she better than Zhongli on these teams? Probably not. I found her to be slightly worse, but the Tenacity of the Millelith set is very finicky for Zhongli to use. If your pillar gets destroyed, if you place it wrong, you're not getting the Zhongli Tenacity buff. So Dehya proccing it very consistently can close the damage gap, although Zhongli still providing the geo-resonance, and the resistance shred is probably a little better anyways, but still this is at least a use for Dehya. And with characters like Arlecchino and Linny being so strong that as long as you can play them properly, you're getting crazy damage, it's totally fine to not run optimal supports. It's not just support impact anymore. Oftentimes the on-field characters are so strong that as long as there's some synergy from a support, the clear times just aren't that much worse. Mualani Vape is something I've seen a lot of players talk about and enjoy Dehya on. Personally, I'm not a super big fan of Mualani on Dehya teams or Dehya on Mualani teams. Theoretically, you can use Kazuha or Sucrose on something like this, create the Crystallize with Shalonen, swirl with Sucrose, and then use Instructor or the Archaic Petra on Dehya. With Instructor, I find that you don't actually have any Hydro Aura left. Sometimes I don't even have any Hydro Aura after using Shalonen. You kind of can't use Shalonen's Burst, which is okay, but if you do, you're reducing so much of the enemy aura. I think in the right Abyss, this is quite a good team. But the other thing is right now, with the Consecrated Beasts in the Abyss, they're very mobile. They're often running out of Dehya's circle. And even though Dehya has a pretty wide range in AoE, the Consecrated Beasts always seem to run outside of it for me. There also is some inconsistency for AoE stuff, and overall I just find I'm I'm just hitting my vapes inconsistently in practice. I know that I shouldn't be. I know that technically, you know, Dehya teams should be perfectly fine here, but I'm just finding in practice it's not as reliable. Moving on to carry Dehya teams. First of all is Plunge. It's definitely not the most meta team. It's definitely not the most meta Plunge team because Diluc just has higher multipliers than Dehya. Diluc, for some reason, has the highest Plunge multipliers in the entire game for whatever reason. One nice thing about Dehya is her skill at least gives you interruption resistance while you're setting up your other characters. Doesn't usually matter, but I guess that's something. It can make the double swirling a little bit easier. There's a higher chance if you use Dehya's skill than Furina's skill and burst to get a double swirl with Shen Yun. Then you can use Bennett and go to town with plunging with Dehya. The circle impact, I would say, is the roughest part of this team. If the enemy runs outside of Bennett's circle, your damage just goes to 0 because you're doing physical plunge damage. So I can't like recommend like pulling for all these high value characters to build this team, but if you have them, it is quite good. If the stars align and you're actually able to attack in Bennett's circle. Unlike her other team, you can actually not worry about energy recharge on this team, which is part of what makes the damage so much higher. You can just focus on attack, pyro damage bonus, and crit damage. I can't really see you using anything other than crit damage due to the Maréchaussée Hunter crit rate, as well as her signature weapon giving crit rate. Overall, definitely not the most meta team, but easily something that can 36 star. And if you really want to play on-field Dehya, then this is the best way at Constellation 0. Still very usable though is Xiaolonen with Furina and Bennett. Dehya is going to be using her burst actually on this team, and you're going to be vaping off of Furina. You don't have that good of pyro application, so Furina's slower app allows you to vape. It's much easier to get a double crystallize than a double swirl with Xiaolonen here, so you're going to use Dehya's skill, then Xiaolonen skill, then Furina burst, then Xiaolonen burst. You're going to get both your sources from the first one, and then you're going to get, with both crystallizes, you're going to activate the scroll set for both elements, and it's going to last Dehya's whole rotation. Then you use Bennett. You may occasionally need to swap back into Furina if you want to totally max fanfare stacks, but you're not losing that many fanfare stacks by just healing Xiaolonen and Bennett, especially since Dehya does heal herself a little bit off field, so you're getting a couple stacks from that. Overall, this team is clearable. I wouldn't say it's good. I wouldn't say it's good until you get C4 Dehya, probably is when this really pops off, just because her energy requirements on this team are so astronomically high. Even with Furina, Xiaolonen on Fav, you'll still need an energy recharge sans and some substats. So overall, the amount of damage you can build onto her is just not as high as you'd really like it to be, but it's still clearable. It's still fine enough. If you don't have Furina, you can also do Mona on this team, but it is really quite cope, and the skill just doesn't quite provide enough hydro to get super consistent vapes. And overall, it's just like, you just really want Furina for this kind of team. But if you do want to use Mona, you do have to use her in Bennett's circle, and you're going to apply the hydro with your normal attack to get the double crystallize. And overall, it's definitely not recommended, but it is something that technically sort of kind of works, especially if a higher constellation Dehya. You can also do mono pyro, something like this, or you can use Xiaolonen instead. Not recommended, especially when the DPS check is higher, unless AoE is really big. And then I've seen some people doing dual carry Raiden Chevreuse, Raiden Dehya. I mean, it does help fix Dehya's ER problems. The thing is, you'd rather just run Xiangling as opposed to Dehya, so this is not like a meta thing, but it's a fun thing that some people like to do. It's just not really what I would recommend. Overall, I actually think Dehya is a pretty solid character, especially for a standard banner. I think people getting one copy of her, especially earlier on in your account before you have too many other characters, is really actually quite valuable. And depending on what you have, it could save you from having to pull certain characters like Zhongli. And of course, her design is absolutely stunning. Truly one of the best designs in Genshin. It's a bit disappointing that her DPS potential is so limited at C0, but at least now that she's a free character, hopefully Dehya Wanters can get lucky and get a couple constellations from losing 50/50s and then pick her as your free standard every year. And then hopefully you'll eventually be able to work towards C4. Personally, I've never lost my 50/50 to Dehya. She's the only standard I've never lost my 50/50 to. But unlike my Tighnari, I actually have, I could have a C6 Tighnari if I wanted to right now. I have like a C8 gene. So it's definitely possible if you've been playing long enough. I am a little bit worried for Dehya's future potential, because I do sort of think that a lot of her value comes from her being an off-field pyro applicator. And although there's like a bunch of really cool and creative and kind of janky ways to use her with all those different artifact sets, I am very worried that the Pyro Archon Mawika will just come in, or Mawika, and just be useful in every single one of Dehya's teams. I am definitely worried about that in terms of Dehya's overall usefulness. I feel like she's just going to get power crept pushed out of the meta by Mawika. However, she is so cheap. She's a free character if you want to choose her. She is so cheap to build. She doesn't require any specific stats. You don't even need to level her weapon. So as a support, you're still not losing anything from building her now. It's not like, you know, you can just leave her at you know, level 70 or whatever and just give her some whatever artifacts. On basically every single one of her supported teams, she needs no investment to be useful. You know, you could just level her talent to like level 7, which is crazy cheap. And just overall, I don't really see a downside to using her if you have a use for her on your account. She's definitely not like crazy meta. She's not good for everyone, but she's one of the more useful standard banner characters and just requires 1 C0 copy. So I definitely recommend giving her a try for those of you that like her and want to build her and have a space for her. She might just surprise you. So let me know if you're building Dehya. Take care. Bye for now.